Vasudevasutam Devam Kamsachanuramaddanam Devaki Paramanandam Krishno Vande Jagatgurum. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Welcome to our ongoing class on Bhagavad Gita in the light of Sri Ramakrishna. Today we're going to primarily focus on the verses of chapter 4 of the Gita, starting with verse 14. And we'll be looking at these verses in the context of chapter 18 of Sri Aurobindo's Essays on the Gita, a beautiful chapter called The Divine Worker, pages 177 to 187 of Essays on the Gita. And you all did a really nice job answering the study questions. I appreciate that. Heads up for the next two classes, because we've reached the end of this year. January classes, it just so happens that I'm not available any of the Sundays in January for the Gita class. So instead, my proposal is the two January classes for the Gita, I suggest we hold on Mondays at 7:30 p.m. Monday, January 13th at 7:30 p.m. here. And Monday, January 27th, 7:30 p.m. So instead of Sunday mornings in January, it'll be Monday, January 13th, 7:30 p.m. and then Monday, January 27th, 7:30 p.m. here. So I hope you guys can make it. And so the assignment for the next class, which will be held on Monday, January 13th, 7:30 p.m., is the next chapter of Sri Aurobindo's Essays on the Gita. It's chapter 19, and it's called Equality. I think it's Sri Aurobindo at his best. It's really brilliant, very helpful and practical for sadhana as well. And so, read chapter 19 of Essays on the Gita, called Equality. Read verses 4.19 to 4.23 of Bhagavad Gita, and answer the study questions based on chapter 19 of Essays on the Gita on equality. Okay? What's the connection between equality? See, one thing, a heads up on this equality chapter, it's not like strictly following the verses in chapter 4 at that point anymore. What it's doing is it's riffing on the fourth sign of the divine worker, which is equality. And the whole it's a kind of chapter-long exposition of fleshing out what the nuances of equality are. Okay? So it's really valuable, I think, and helpful. So let's plunge right in. Please open your apps. And let's start with 4.14. And you'll find that the study questions 1 through 4, they'll come up in the context of the verses that we'll be going through, and I'll talk about some of your responses then. So, please repeat after me. 4.14. Namam karmani limpanti name karma phale spriha itimam yo bhijanati karma bhir nasabadhyate. Alright. Karma phale me spriha namam karmani nalimpanti. God himself, Krishna, right? God in the form of the incarnation Krishna is telling Arjuna, when I act, when I work, I do so without any hankering whatsoever after karma phala, after the fruits of my actions. Namam karmani nalimpanti. And I'm not attached to the works themselves. See, we should always remember, karma yoga involves non-attachment to two things. Not just to the fruits of your actions, whether you get recognition, name and fame, whether you succeed or fail, but you shouldn't be attached to the work itself. You might not be attached to the fruits of the work, but still be very attached to the work, and that's still not good enough. It's a good step in the right direction, but ultimately you want to be free from attachment even to the work itself. So Krishna says, I'm not attached to any of the fruits of my actions. I'm also not attached to the action itself that I'm doing. And then he says, Iti yaha mam abhijanati saha karmabhi na badhyate. That person who knows this, the secret of action and how I act as the perfect divine worker, that person will never be bound by his actions. Okay? So again, this should remind us of verses 3.21 to 24. Do you remember when Krishna himself, when he's talking about karma yoga, it says, I myself am the ideal karma yogi. And if I cease to act for even a moment, this whole world would fall to pieces, right? So act like I'm acting. So this 4.14 is kind of going back to that same idea, is that God himself is setting the example of the perfect ideal divine worker. We should try to emulate God in this regard. Okay. We might think of Holy Mother, Shara Devi. We just had the afternoon program, a beautiful afternoon program on Sunday, where a lot of people talked about how simple and unassuming Holy Mother was, right? As a human being, she would spend most of her day cutting vegetables, cooking for her guests, for Sri Ramakrishna, this and that, but completely unattached to anything she was doing, and at the same time, with constant recollection of God. She would say that she would manage to repeat the mantra 100,000 times per day, ek lok ko jap, every single day, in the midst of all of her activities. How is that possible? Perfect divine worker. Okay, 4.15. Please repeat after me. Evam gyatva kritam karma purvair api mumukshubhihi kuru karmaiva tasmat tvam purvaihi purvataram kritam. Okay. Purvaihi mumukshubhihi api evam gyatva karma kritam. Okay. See, people in old times, the great sages of old times, they followed my example and did work in this way. This verse is going back to the very first verse of chapter 4. Do you guys remember? Imam vivaspate yogam. Krishna tells Arjuna that long back I taught this ancient yoga to this sage who passed it on to this sage, but then in the course of time, that ancient wisdom got lost. And now Krishna is reviving it. So again, the 4.15 is going back to 4.1 here. This used to be practiced. If you look at the Isha Upanishad, second mantra, does anyone know right off the top of their head? Kurvan neveha karmaani jiji vishet shatagga samaaha. One should wish to live 100 years engaging in action constantly. But how? As karma yoga. Na karma lipyate na re, in an unattached way. This is that ancient kind of karma yoga that Krishna is trying to revive in the Bhagavad Gita. So try to emulate Sri Krishna himself, God himself, as the perfect divine worker, who has these 5 main qualities. You guys all did a great job answering study question number 2 on the 5 signs of the divine worker. Here are the 5 signs. Number 1, absence of personal egoism and doership. 2, desirelessness. 3, spiritual impersonality. 4, equality. As I said, our next reading assignment, there's a whole chapter on equality, elaborating this 4th quality. And 5th, perfect contentment and inner joy and peace. And in some of your responses, you give some nice elaborations of some of these. I wanted to just share with you some of them. First of all, Karthik makes an interesting point. He joined us recently. He's based in India. He says, not sure if there's a 6th sign, but on page 186, Sri Aurobindo says that the, quote, Traigunyatitya is also a high sign of the divine worker, and posits the Purushottama as the one who inspires Prakriti to act. So he raised an interesting question of whether there are 5 or maybe possibly a 6th sign of the divine worker. I think it's a nice point to make. It's right more or less in the middle of the page, a little bit below the middle of the page, 186. This superiority of the calm soul, observing its action but not involved in it. This Traigunatitya is also a high sign of the divine worker. Yeah. So he doesn't label it as a 6th one, but it's possible that it could be. So maybe I can just...
But wouldn't this number 5 be the same thing as
The perfect
Trigunatita?
contentment?
Well, because if you have inner joy,
You think that's an
and
aspect
peace,
of 5?
The quality that's required.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So we can build it under...
I actually had it 5 under 2, desirelessness, because I moved it there, and I put Trigunatita as my 5th.
Yeah.
Really all interrelated.
So exactly. One thing that's really important about these 5 signs is that they're interrelated. They're not in airtight compartments. You can't have desirelessness without... In fact, Sri Aurobindo says, desirelessness follows automatically from perfect achievement of absence of personal egoism and doership. Without doership, desire has no legs to stand on, right? And so they're all kind of interlinked. But at the same time, he's just like picking out certain facets that are all kind of in the same network. And so Traigunya Titya means going beyond the three gunas, and either you can include it as belonging as a kind of subset of or an aspect of the fifth quality of perfect contentment and inner joy and peace, which you can only have once you've completely transcended the gunas. Or you can think of it as possibly a sixth quality. Nothing too much depends on what we decide to do there. But thank you, Karthik. That's an interesting point. Animish talks about, I think out of these five, maybe the one that might be initially a little bit puzzling or not obvious is maybe the third, impersonality. In what sense are we being impersonal? Especially because Sri Aurobindo is not like a follower of Shankara, right? And we know that Shankara is the one who taught the impersonal Brahman and this and that. So he doesn't mean impersonality in that sense, right? That's important to keep in mind. Or that you should become cold and, not loving, right? Not that. So Animish, he has a nice way of explaining it. He says, his will, mind, or heart becomes an instrument of nature executed by her. So they lack the strong knot of personality, which can only arise from the notion of doership. So it's a kind of egoistic personality. In his work, there will be still will, reason, and emotion, as these three are fundamental to mind, but they will not be tied to a strong ego. In the words of Sri Ramakrishna, the Kancha Ami has died. That means the unripe I. And Paka Ami, the ripe I, is just a working knot of the impersonal cosmos. And I would add that the impersonal cosmos itself is ultimately governed by the Purushottama, the divine Purushottama, right? Anthony says that when he explains spiritual impersonality, this too is a recognition that an impersonal divine is working through the human form. This person receives what the divine provided and allows what departs from the person to leave without any sense of loss. Ultimately, nothing is gained or lost. All is a reflection of the divine Purushottama. And Kelly, she makes a nice point about equality or equanimity, the fourth sign of the divine worker. She says, this is an inner state of having no desire for any particular outcome, being unmoved by seeming good outcomes or bad outcomes. One sees the divine in all equally and knows there is no one to lose or gain anything, nothing to be gained or lost. And she gives a great example. One prime example of this sign, this equality, is Sri Ram in the Ramayana. When it was announced that he would be king, Sri Ram showed no signs of excitement or desire for this role. He merely accepted it as a duty to be performed according to his father's wishes. When it was declared not long after that announcement that he would be exiled to the forest for 14 years, he expressed no grief or sorrow or desire to stay in Ayodhya. In fact, he consoled others who were grieving for him. So I think that is a really nice example of equality, equanimity. Okay, and there are a lot more answers. I can't. The number is growing, fortunately, of online participants. It's almost too much to keep up with, but it's good. It's good in a good way. Okay, so let's keep going. Verse 16. Please repeat after me. Kim karma, kim akarmeti, kavayo, api atra, mohitaha, tatte karma, pravakshyami, yajñatva, mokshyase, ashubhat. Yeah, I don't know if you're noticing, it's not, if you guys can read Devanagari, it might sound like I'm deviating from the text. It's because I'm sometimes breaking up the sandhi to make the meaning of, because that shubhat, it's actually ashubhat. And that little at the beginning of a word in Sanskrit will reverse the meaning. So you have to be very careful. It liberates you from everything that is ashubha, inauspicious, bad. So the actual word is ashubhat, but because of sandhi, euphonious combination of letters in Sanskrit, it becomes mokshase shubhat. Okay. So, kim karma, kim akarma iti, atra kavayaha api mohitaha. Even wise souls, the greatest intellects, are puzzled by what exactly is karma, action, and what exactly is akarma, inaction. Tat karma te pravakshami. So I will now teach you, as God himself, what action really means, yat gyatva ashubhat mokshase. Knowing which you will be liberated from all inauspiciousness, all evil. Okay? Here, Sri Aurobindo says something very briefly, but I think which, let's see here. It's on page 177, the very beginning of the chapter. He says, action in the world is like a deep forest, gahana, through which man goes stumbling as best he can. Actually, this is referring to, you know what? Here, let's read the next verse too, and then we can read them both together. Okay. 4.17. Karmano hi api bodhavyam cha vikarmanaha akarmanascha bodhavyam gahana karmano gatihi. Okay. Karmanaha bodhavyam. One has to understand, gain knowledge of karma, of action. Vikarmanaha cha api bodhavyam. One should also become aware of what vikarma is. Vikarma means wrong action, the thing not to do. And then finally, akarmanaha cha bodhavyam. One should also become aware of, gain knowledge of, what is akarma, inaction, what is true inaction. Hi karmanaha gatihi gahana. Because thick and tangled is the way of action, of works. It's a beautiful little metaphor. Gahana karmano gatihi. Action is very mysterious and puzzling and baffling indeed. And so in this context, in the context of both these verses, Sri Aurobindo says, page 177, action in the world is like a deep forest, gahana, through which man goes stumbling as best he can, by the light of the ideas of his time, the standards of his personality, his environment, or rather of many times, many personalities, layers of thought and ethics from many social stages, all inextricably confused together, temporal and conventional amidst all their claim to absoluteness and immutable truth, empirical and irrational in spite of their aping of right reason. And finally, the sage, seeking in the midst of it all a highest foundation of fixed law and an original truth, finds himself obliged to raise the last supreme question, whether all action and life itself are not a delusion and a snare, and whether cessation from action, akarma, is not the last resort of the tired and disillusioned human soul. But, says Krishna, in this matter even the sages are perplexed and deluded. For by action, by works, not by inaction, comes the knowledge and the release. So depending on what our standards are, standards of what we believe is the right thing to do, our own personal ethics, but also our standards of the society we happen to live in, the culture we're raised in, what kind of parents we had and what values they raised us with. All these things are going to affect the way that we think about what we should do, what we shouldn't do. But there must be a higher absolute standard. And this is what Sri Krishna goes on to suggest in the next verse, a spiritual absolute standard. In the next few verses, he explains them. So, let's look at 4.18. Karmani akarma yaha pashed akarmani cha karma yaha sabuddhiman manushyeshu sayuktaha kritsna karmakrit. Okay, very important verse. Study question 1 is based on this verse. What was study question 1? What exactly does Krishna mean when he says inaction in action and action in inaction? Obviously, they're meant to be paradoxical. But let's first look at the verse. Yaha karmani akarma yaha cha. So that person who sees inaction, akarma, inaction. This whole inaction thing is getting a little confusing. Okay, anyway, but you get what I mean. Karma pashyet, and then akarmani karma pashyet, and who in akarma, meaning inaction, sees karma, action. Saha, that person, manusheshu buddhiman, he alone or she alone is the wise one among so many people. Saha yuktaha, that person is a true yogi. truly harmonized in union with the divine is Sri Aurobindo's very expressive and I think apt way of putting it. Yukta, because he's going back to the etymology of the word. Yoga, what does yoga come from? Yuj, connecting, binding, union, united. Right? So this person alone is truly united with the divine. Kritsna karmakrit. This is the word that Sri Aurobindo makes heavy weather of. Kritsna karmakrit. A doer of all actions across the board. This reminds me of something Sister Nivedita said. She wrote this masterful introduction to Swami Vivekananda's complete works, where she says, what was the essence of Swami Vivekananda's teachings? He says, henceforth, no distinction between sacred and secular. To work is to worship. Right? And so on and so forth. And it's very beautiful. That's the same idea. It's not that there's some actions that are inherently spiritual, like doing puja, doing japa, and then there's the rest of your life, raising kids and fighting with your coworkers and going to the gym. No! Everything can and should be spiritual, right? An opportunity for spiritual practice. It can be a yoga. That's why one of my favorite phrases of Sri Aurobindo is, all life is yoga, right? In this sense. So in this sense, I think he also is interpreting kritsna karmakrit, the doer of all actions. You can do everything. Everything depends on your attitude. If you can spiritualize your attitude, literally everything becomes an opportunity for uniting with the divine, for deepening your connection with the divine. Okay. Now, with regard to this study question, I want to read to you at least one response. Shubho, one of the online participants, says, action and inaction means even when somebody is not doing anything, sitting like a clod of stone, still Prakriti and the flow of gunas are acting through him or her. Breathing, other bodily functions, thinking, etc. are happening. So at the physical level, things are still actually happening. Thus, these are also activities of Prakriti, though it seems like inertia from outside. I would also add here that the mind itself falls under Prakriti. And when we get to the questions, I will open it to questions, but Ellis had a question kind of relating this mind issue and where it falls. So, but yes, mind definitely falls on the side of insentient nature, and the three gunas are working through the mind as well. And so when you're sitting stock still, literally nothing is moving, your mind can still be working constantly, right? Because of the admixture of the three gunas, and so the mind, you'll be thinking all sorts of thoughts and this and that. So in that sense too, I think action and inaction, right? And then Shubho says, inaction and inaction, okay, I-N-A-C-T-I-O-N, one word, inaction, is twofold. It means that one should not renounce any works or activities. They should continue doing that, but knowing, realizing that Purusha, or my true eternal self, the Atman, is inactive, the non-doer. So the Akshara Purusha, remember always, Sri Aurobindo has in mind from the beginning, the triple Purusha from chapter 15 of the Gita, Kshara Purusha, Akshara Purusha, Purushottama. So I think Shubho here usefully distinguishes the Akshara Purusha from the Purushottama. So he says, first you think of the Akshara here. Purusha, or my true eternal self, is inactive, the non-doer, and detached, even when the body-mind self, Prakriti, is ever active. And secondly, the divine Purushottama, what Sri Ramakrishna called Brahma Shakti. I'll just add here, I'm not aware that Sri Ramakrishna himself called the ultimate reality Brahma Shakti. He definitely meant that, but it was M, I believe, who actually coined the phrase Brahma Shakti. I could be wrong, but as far as in all the literature I've read, I only find M referring to Sri Ramakrishna's understanding of the divine as Brahma-Shakti. It's a very beautiful formulation. Yes, but point is well taken. Okay, so secondly, divine Purushottama, what Sri Ramakrishna called Brahma Shakti, is the ultimate doer of everything. And my own self, along with the body-mind complex, are its mere instruments. Here also the self is detached, inactive, the non-agent, because God alone is the doer here. Here I am a mere instrument and not the doer. Entire doership is realized by the saint to be Purushottama. Okay. So inaction and inaction in two senses, right? Even in the midst of intense activity, Swamiji giving lectures all the time, and Holy Mother cutting her vegetable and this and that, how can there be inaction? If you are stationed in the quiet serenity of the inactive Akshara Purusha, first of all, and secondly, if you're free from that fever of egoism and doership, then what happens? You lose that first, right? You lose that sense of doership. In that sense, you are not acting at all. You as that personal I, that unripe I, right? And you become just a pure, perfect instrument or vessel for the Purushottama to act. So I think in both those senses we have inaction in the midst of intense activity. Okay? And let's see here. So now, let's look at the next verse, 4.19, and I'll bring up study questions 3 and 4 in the context of the next verse. 4.19, please repeat after me. Yasya sarve samarambhaah kama sankalpa vajjitaah jnanagni dagdhakarmanam tam ahuhu panditam buddhaah. All right. Yasya sarve samarambhaah. That person for whom all undertakings, samarambhaah, kama sankalpa vajjitaah, are completely devoid of all kama, desire, and wish, any kind of expectations or desires. Jnana agni dagda karmanam tam buddhaah panditam ahu. That person whose karma, whose actions are completely burned up, purified by jnanagni. It's a beautiful metaphor, by the fire of spiritual knowledge. That person is a true sage, a true knower among human beings, buddhaah. Okay, so Sri Aurobindo, where does he get these 5 qualities from? Roughly from these verses in chapter 4. And he especially gets the first sign of the divine worker, second, desirelessness, from this phrase in verse 19, kama sankalpa vajjitaah, completely free from all kama and sankalpa, free from all desires, free from all expectations, hopes. I want this to happen, I don't want this to happen, those kinds of things. Okay. Sri Aurobindo adds in his commentary on this, which I think is really helpful, he says, you even have to give up the desire to serve successfully, even if it's serving God. Even that's a desire. It's a better desire. But even that, at the highest level, it's not up to you. Because it's God who gives you the power to serve him successfully or not. And so if you're completely surrendered to the divine, you won't even have that. You'll just say, you know, O Lord, how well or how badly I serve you. I'm going to do my best. But everything is up to you. So I thought that was a nice point. So now, in this context, I asked study questions 3 and 4, and you guys gave some really thoughtful and personal responses to these questions. So I'll probably err on the side of not mentioning names here. Not that there's anything too scandalous, but just so that people don't feel called out or put in the spotlight. So study question number 3. A common objection to the Gita's teachings on karma yoga is that if we act without desire for the fruits of our actions, our work will be mediocre, or we will act in a half-hearted manner. How would Sri Aurobindo respond to this objection? I should have added, how would you respond to this objection? You wouldn't have to be that dependent on Sri Aurobindo here. Okay, so one person says, Sri Aurobindo responds by saying that the hopes and fears... this is actually, there's nothing personal here, so I can... Ellis says, Sri Aurobindo responds by saying that the hopes and fears associated with attachment to the fruits of actions actually blinds us and could be an obstacle to doing great work. Usually, attachment to fruits comes with fear of failure, fear of judgment, and a certain mentality of scarcity. I like the way you put that. Sri Aurobindo makes the claim that work done from the tranquil, less egoic state of karma yoga is more conducive to perfect work, uninhibited by these external baggages. So I think that's the essence of the answer, which is that having these personal expectations, desires, anxieties, right? All the different kinds of fear you're talking about, fear of failure, fear of judgment, all these things handicap your ability to do the work to the best of your ability, right? Of course, you do see people who are very rajasic and very attached to the work and to the fruits of the work who do good work. That's true too. It's not that you're guaranteed to do bad work. But that same Rajasic person, if they're free from those desires, they'll be even better. And a lot of you kind of gave answers along the same lines. Sultan, who has graced us with his presence today, all the way from Berkeley. Sultan says, Sri Aurobindo would argue that our desires are actually what make us mediocre workers. Our desires delude our minds and diminish our intelligence. They cause uneasiness and inconsistency when we are performing tasks. It is only when desires are eradicated can we work with concentration, skill, and consistency. And an online participant named Max says the following, along the same lines, but just adding little nuances here and there and bringing in some helpful concepts. Max says, on the top of page 180, Sri Aurobindo talks about how being attached emotionally to the outcome is actually detrimental to success. In modern parlance, when you're too concerned with the result, it creates anxiety. A lot of people talk about how perfectionism is self-sabotaging. What's really going perhaps is an attempt to control outcomes. So what you need to get rid of is this desire to control outcomes. I also like that way of putting it. This perfectionistic kind of impulse to that. It just makes you anxious, right? And so if you're free from that anxiety, you'll be a better worker. I think that's the logic. Okay, so a lot of you gave responses along the same lines, and I think that's very helpful. Kelly, for instance, says, essentially, one who acts without the desire for the fruits of actions acts only for the highest good with the highest purpose and with the acts only for the highest good with the highest purpose and with the highest skill. One becomes a vessel for the divine to work through him or her without a desire for a particular outcome or experience. It's the desire to grasp at things that one believes will bring pleasure and joy and push away that which one believes brings fear and pain that clouds judgment and leads to the mediocrity of a middling human will. Okay, good. Now, study question number 4, which is a little more personal. This is where I'll probably not mention names. The question is, in your own spiritual practice, have you tried to practice Karma Yoga? If so, what form does your Karma Yoga take? What benefits have you gained from Karma Yoga? And what challenges do you face when trying to practice Karma Yoga? Okay. So one person who's a musician, an online participant, talks about his work with music. He says, yes, when recording music, I try to view it as Karma Yoga and as an offering to the divine. As I've continued approaching music in this way, I feel less self-doubt about it and view it as being a conduit for something greater than myself, about something greater than myself. However, I'm an overthinker perfectionist. So perfectionism is a theme that's coming up as one of the challenges that some people are facing. I have that too. I'm a Virgo, so, at least from the Western standpoint. However, I'm an overthinker perfectionist by nature and struggle with being detached from the fruits of my actions, as I often worry about the outcomes. Really interesting resonances across the responses, right? I also struggle with viewing it as an offering to the divine and not being a perfectionist because it feels that I should offer the best I can. However, I'm beginning to realize that perhaps counterintuitively, but in line with Sri Aurobindo's line of thought, the product is better when I try less and allow the music to come through me. I think this is quite profound, and it's also like him really just thinking deeply and through his own Karma Yoga as a musician and the challenges he faces. I think that's really helpful. Another person says, I've been trying to increasingly practice Karma Yoga in my daily life. I try to make all of my daily activities a sort of Karma Yoga, especially workouts, work and household activities, by consciously dedicating and surrendering my activity to God before I start, and by offering the activity and fruits thereof to God after. So this is a very practical tip, which I always give people when people ask, how do we do Karma Yoga? Because all this stuff is pretty high level, right? Like, oh, all you have to do is get rid of doership and don't be egoistic. Don't be selfish. Like, oh, easier said than done. But there are simple, practical, concrete steps we can take to begin with. And this is a really helpful one. Right before you engage in some kind of activity, your daily work, you can literally repeat a mantra, but you don't need to. But just mentally or verbally, offer what you're about to do to the divine. In the midst of the work, once in a while, try to check in with God again. At the end of the work, you can either repeat a mantra or again, just mentally offer what you just did to the divine again. That's helpful. Then the same person continues, I like this because it centers me before activities and helps to serve as a spiritual practice outside of dedicated meditation times. I find that it helps to temper my ego before certain activities as well, as I try to take the me out of my doing, to some extent at least. I also find that I'm able to increase my viveka and remember that spiritual realization is my ultimate aim, even as I do mundane activities or have to surround myself with people and conversations that are not particularly spiritual or sattvic. This person's a householder. And this reminds me of, how many of you have read The Practice of the Presence of God by Brother Lawrence? Yeah, because he was a great saint, but he became a saint through very ordinary activities. He was what we call in our order the Bhandari Maharaj, which means the monk who's in charge of the kitchen. And so he's in there like Holy Mother, cutting the potatoes, doing the grocery shopping and this and that, arguing with the workers and blah, blah. And he has the whole book is just a collection of his letters. He was so self-effacing. He didn't publish anything or give lectures, but he wrote these private letters, and Practice of the Present God is a compilation of these letters, beautiful letters. And in one of them, he says something really profound. He's expressing his own spiritual attitude. He says, I feel more connected with God when I'm in the kitchen. I feel the palpable presence of the divine more strongly than when I'm at prayer in the church. And that's the beauty of karma yoga, because it helps you to connect with the divine even in the midst of your activities. And for many of us, because we have rajas in us, right? So we feel inclined to work. So if we have that rajas, what happens? When we're in the meditation room, we start thinking about what we need to do for the day, and when our mind's distracted, we're trying to think of God, but we have difficulty. But now that same person, if they're engaged in some kind of work that they love or that they're meant to be doing, raising their kids or whatever, it might be easier for them to bring in the divine and feel connected with the divine in the midst of that work, right? Just because of the nature of their temperament and their makeup. That seems to me the idea. And then the same person says regarding challenges, because I asked about challenges as well. The challenge with this practice is just in remembering to do it. Oftentimes when rushing or shifting from one activity to the next, I forget to take my moments before and after to surrender my actions. I find, however, that like with any habit, it takes practice, and the more I do it, the better I become at remembering to do it. In addition, the more I do it, the more I catch myself at times either taking an egoistic approach to an activity or egoistically soaking up the fruits of an activity, and I'm reminded to surrender it all to God with gratitude for her grace. And so we're all works in progress, but that's a really great start. And then it's constant remembrance, right? That seems to me to be what the practice is that you should, when the person's saying you should check yourself and this and that, check in with yourself, ask yourself whether you're think of the divine in the midst of your activities. Another person says, I do practice karma yoga. My form is trying to serve the divine through serving others by performing what I recognize my duties to be. The benefit is a higher perspective and less susceptibility to attachments and emotions. The challenges are great. It sometimes is difficult to distinguish between serving my limited ego and attachments from serving the divine. The work also can appear tiring and unrewarding and unrelenting and disappointing, and they're opposites. But I try to remind myself that everything that comes is through the divine, and that the little apparent I that feels itself is just an illusion. My karma yoga practice helps me to realize that. So there are a few challenges here. One of them is, this is tricky, and this is where the other person mentioning viveka, which means discrimination or discernment. I think this person is also saying the same thing here. It's all well and good to say that you should try to take the ego out of your work, but the ego is so tricky and so insidious that the ego will make you think that you're doing something very spiritual and selfless, but it ends up being in the service of the ego. And then you get this puffed up spiritual ego, and that's the worst. Swamiji used to say that the worst kind of ego is the spiritual ego. I'm better than you because I'm more spiritual than you. And then all hope is lost. So it's really dangerous here. And Sri Ramakrishna talks about it. That's why he says in the gospel many, many times, he says, karma yoga is great. The Gita is all about that. Do it. But the ego has a way of rearing its ugly head, even in the midst of the most so-called spiritual activities. He says, you're donating in charity, you're doing this and that, seems to be so wonderful. But there's ego involved. He talks about the Rajasika Bhakta, that devotee who calls on God in the middle of a great assembly, and wearing really flashy clothes, praying in a very loud and public way so that others, can note. He gets the attention of the other people in the room, and they start admiring it. Wow, he's a very spiritual person. It's very dangerous. So this is something that that doesn't mean we should not do karma yoga. It means we should be aware of the dangers. Every spiritual practice has its dangers. I give a whole talk in Trabuco a while ago called Self-Deception in Spiritual Life. And I go through each of the 4 yogas, and they're dangers. The danger in Jnana Yoga, the path of knowledge, is what? Thinking that you're already enlightened. This is one of the biggest problems these days in what's called Neo-Advaita. The biggest problem one of the biggest problems in Bhakti, the path of devotion, is what? Becoming overly sentimental, becoming kind of weak and sort of like, I'm useless, I'm a nobody, I'm a sinner, and this and that. That could also be dangerous or unhealthy in spiritual life. So every path has its dangers. I think one of the greatest dangers in karma yoga is self-deception in the form of, I'm doing this, especially, it's all about doing rather than saying. The less you talk, the better, and the more you do. And the people who brag about being great karma yogis and talking about karma yoga all the time, there's something is off. And so just be careful of ego in karma yoga. I think that's the most important thing. An online participant who's a doctor in India, he says, I'm a physician by profession. I get to serve sick people every day. I try to do my job to the best of my ability with an attitude of service. I pray at the end of the day while leaving the hospital. So this is similar to the other person's, this practice of before and after you offer the work to God. Sri Ramakrishna Parnamastu. Let this be an offering to Sri Ramakrishna. There are so many challenges and difficulties that I can write a book on this topic. But to put it in short, our social structure, he's talking about India here, our social structure is very complex. And while we are engaged in karma yoga, we come in contact with so many different varieties of people, from simple and honest to crooked and wicked, that it is very difficult to strike the right balance of being spiritual yet practical at many times. So he's raising another, I think, really difficult challenge for people whose work involves interacting with other people, because you meet people from all walks of life. And it's all well and good to quote the scriptures saying that you should always speak sweetly, anudvegakaram vakyam satyam, you should speak truthfully, but at the same time very sweetly, you should never hurt anybody. Is that always practical and realistic and possible in all contexts? Probably not. That's why Sri Ramakrishna, always practical. He has the example of a snake. And there's a whole story associated with it. I'm not going into the whole story, but the moral of the story is what? Sometimes, he says you should never bite, but a householder can still hiss once in a while. And even I would add some monks in our ashrama environment, when you live in a large community, sometimes even monks have to hiss a little bit. So it means there's no bite behind it. You're not actually actively harming the person, but you have to make a show sometimes of anger. A show of anger. That means what? You might even be yelling. Sometimes parents have to scold their kids. That's possible. You can't always be too soft and accommodating, otherwise the kid's going to trample over you. But inwardly, how are you feeling? Do you feel the anger within? So hissing but not biting, I take it to mean externally you may have to scold people, you may have to raise your voice, this and that. Whatever, you take the situation in context. But inwardly, so hissing but not biting means there's no emotional reaction there. You don't let it linger. There's no festering resentments or anger. That's how I see it. Another person says, I find that the biggest challenge I face practicing karma yoga is pride. The moment that there is failure, my pride becomes damaged and causes a feeling of insecurity that leads to comparison and competition. When the mind is competitive, desires explode, and I have the urge to improve, not for becoming more proficient in a task, but to become more proficient than others. So you become competitive. I want to be better than this person. If I'm able to be more equal in honor and dishonor, I feel that I will be able to focus on purifying the karma and not trying to be better than others. And finally, another person says, I try every day through my sadhana and prayers to ascribe all results of all my actions to the divine. A harder task has been to remove desire from the end results of whatever my actions are, such as giving and helping the homeless or completing my studies for certification. Issues of pride and self-congratulation are certainly pallets in the way of my seeking ego dissolution. Constant reminders of my belief in Brahman as being the one without a second help to guide my hand to recognize that things I do are always as God's hands. So the challenge here seems to be to know, again, pride. You notice that there's, again, that issue of, first of all, if you're doing something and you're doing it, even if you're doing it for God, you want to do your best, right? And that's true. You should do your best, but at the same time, not become too overly concerned about doing your best, because even that is ultimately in God's hands, right? Okay. Should we go on to 4.20? Yes, I think we should. 4.20. Please repeat after me, because this captures the fourth and fifth signs of the divine worker. Tyaktva karma phala sangam nitya tripto nirashrayah karmanyabi pravrittopi naiva kinchit karoti saha. Karmaphala asangam tyaktva, having renounced all attachment to karmaphala, the fruits of actions. Nirashrayah, not being dependent on anything or anyone, or even on the action itself as this, like I need to do this because I love it and without it I can't live. Nitya triptaha, ever content in oneself. So this fifth sign, perfect contentment and inner joy and peace. Content in oneself without needing it, depending on anything external. Saha, that person, karmani abhipravrittaha api, even though engaging intensely in all kinds of activities. Kinchit nakaroti eva, that person does nothing. So this is an elaboration actually of what it means to be inactive in the midst of intense activity, right? Because you are identified with that deeper soul within. Non-doership. Because at both levels, which I forgot who it was that mentioned it, but at both the level of the Akshara Purusha and the Purushottama. As the Akshara Purusha, you are the impersonal Atman, the non-doer, the inactive self with the capital S. And at the level of the Purushottama, you're an instrument of the Purushottama. But at both levels, you're the non-doer. So you're inactive in both those senses, right? Okay. There are a bunch of questions, and I won't have time to address all of them, but I do want to address as many as I can. So Ellis had a question on page 179 of Essays on the Gita. He says, Sri Aurobindo writes, the human mind and soul of the liberated man does nothing, even though through his nature he engages in action. And this is a nuance that he picks up on, which I think is helpful. He says, I'm having trouble interpreting what Sri Aurobindo means by mind here. The mind is a part of nature, is it not? Also, how can the body act without input from the mind, even if that action is cut off at the level of the senses, as it were? A small thing that doesn't necessarily hamper my overall understanding, but how do you interpret the statement? It seems a bit out of place. Okay, so here's how I see it. It's 179 toward the bottom, right? Okay, he said, so Sri Aurobindo says, the human mind and soul of the liberated man does nothing, na kinchit karoti. And then he adds, even though through his nature he engages in action. It is the nature, the executive Shakti. It is the conscious goddess governed by the divine inhabitant who does the work. So I think we need to take the sentence as a whole here. And I get what you're asking. You're saying, wait a minute, the first part of the sentence, the mind does nothing. How is that possible? The mind is also part of Prakriti. It's composed of the three gunas, and so it should be active, right? That's true. But then he's adding a nuance right after that. Even though through his nature he engages in action. So he's acknowledging that. And I take his nature there to include both the physical body and the subtle body in the form of the mind. He's engaging in action at the level of mind. He's admitting that. And then he says, it is the nature with a capital N. This is Shakti. The executive Shakti. It is a conscious goddess governed by the divine inhabitant who does the work using that mind as her instrument. So that, I think, is that okay as an answer? Yeah. Karthik asks a number of questions. I'm not going to read all of them, but one of them is on page 185, when Sri Aurobindo critiques outward sannyasa, is Sri Aurobindo departing from Swami Vivekananda's views? This is an interesting question because, of course, many of you are devotees in our tradition. Some of you are like, well, then why are you reading Sri Aurobindo's commentary on the Gita? But part of the reason is because we haven't produced a homegrown commentary on the Gita strictly from the standpoint of Sri Ramakrishna. We don't have it yet. I want to do that in the future, God willing. But it seems to me that the best commentary available out of all the commentaries I've ever read that really interprets the Gita consistently from the standpoint of Sri Ramakrishna is Sri Aurobindo's Essays on the Gita. So this is the kind of question that comes up, is when you try to reconcile what Sri Aurobindo is saying sometimes in his commentary with what Sri Ramakrishna teaches, with what Swami Vivekananda teaches. Karthik is asking, on page 185, isn't he critiquing outward sannyasa, which is exactly what Swami Vivekananda thought was a great lifestyle and one of the ideals in Indian spiritual culture. Let's see what he says on page 185. This is in the Divine Worker chapter. This is 4 lines down. In fact, Tyaga itself is the real and sufficient sannyasa. Tyaga, the word Tyaga, which means renunciation. And then, quote, he should be known as the eternal sannyasin who neither hates nor desires. Free from the dualities, he is happily and easily released from all bondage. End quote. So this is 5.3. Nyeha sanitya sannyasi yona dveshna kankshati. Okay. Then Sri Aurobindo adds, this is what Karthik is referring to, the painful process of outward sannyasa, dukkhamaptum, this 5.6, is an unnecessary process. It is perfectly true that all actions, as well as the fruit of action, have to be given up, to be renounced, but inwardly, not outwardly, not into the inertia of nature, but to the Lord in sacrifice, into the calm and joy of the impersonal, from whom all action proceeds without disturbing his peace. The true sannyasa of action is the reposing of all works on the Brahman. I think this is a great question to ask. Is Sri Aurobindo interpreting the Gita as rejecting outward sannyasa, external sannyasa? My take on this is the following. What is external sannyasa? It means, when people would ask Sri Ramakrishna the same kind of question, he would say, if you're a householder, you should renounce inwardly. If you're a sannyasi, you should renounce inwardly and externally, outwardly, right? What does it mean? It means, with regard to, for instance, if you're a man and you're heterosexual, then the object of desire, lust for you is a woman, right? To a householder, he'll say, you should try as much as possible inwardly to renounce attachment to your wife, for instance. For a sannyasi, the sannyasi also should be externally renouncing ties to and attachments to all women. That's the idea. What's the connection, though, between these two things? Is there a connection between? Can't you just have the inward sannyasa? And isn't that the more important thing? I think Swamiji would agree with Krishna, who says that the true sannyasi, the eternal sannyasi, the deepest sannyasi, is the one who has renounced all inner desire and aversion. Definitely true. But I think Swamiji would add, for the vast majority of people, it's extremely difficult to achieve that inner freedom from desire and aversion without some level of control at the external level. And Sri Ramakrishna will say the same thing. He says, if you enter a room full of soot, no matter how clever you are, your shirt's going to get stained in some way. And so you have to know where you stand. This doesn't mean that everybody's meant to be a sannyasi. That's not the point. But you have to figure out where you stand. And be honest with yourself. We're all falling short of the ideal to different degrees. Where are we now? Where's the ideal? Let's not drag down the ideal, but where do we stand in relation to the ideal? As a householder and as a sannyasi, because as sannyasi, there's a whole range of sannyasis and how sincere they are, and there's another danger of spiritual pride there. The moment you wear this, your ego gets puffed up, and I'm superior to householders, and this and that. It becomes a whole. You start shooting yourself in the foot in spiritual life if you start thinking along those lines. And so each person is different. You have to know for yourself what the best path is for you to make spiritual progress. I'm going to Uttarkashi again after a few years. I love Uttarkashi to do some austerity. And I met some sadhus there, some monks who are very good monks, but they chose never to take sannyasa, even though they're obviously not householders and they live a very austere, simple, pure life. But they like the simplicity and humility of white, and they don't want a Swami name. They don't want the ochre. They don't want people bowing down to them. So they just live these unassuming lives and, forget about Uttarkashi. In our own tradition, I think it was Brahmananda one day sitting with, was it Premananda? Who knows? I think it was Brahmananda who turns to Premananda one day and says, don't you think it would be better for us not to be wearing this? Wouldn't it be just nice to be complete? Why did Sri Ramakrishna not wear Gedua? This is a real question. He was a sannyasi. He got initiated by Totapuri. But he chose not to. He didn't call himself a Swami. When people asked him, are you a sadhu? He goes, I'm not a sadhu. And he literally said, I had 2 wishes. 2 things I prayed to Mother for. Number 1, to be Bhakti Raja, to be the king of all bhaktas. And number 2, I don't want to be a dry sadhu.
Right, jnani, right?
He literally said sadhu in that place. You look it up, the Bangla there.
Okay.
I don't really, and he used the word sadhu. Shutka sadhu or something like that, like a dry sadhu. We're dry sadhus. Okay. Let's see. Animesh. Respected Swamiji, first please accept my pranam. See the pranams, very dangerous. Okay, I have a slight I have a slight doubt on Ksharapurusha and Aparaprakriti. This is a kind of a technical question here. Okay, so he's asking a question about the relationship between these two concepts in the Gita. Ksharapurusha mentioned in chapter 15 of the Gita, and Aparaprakriti mentioned in chapter 7, I believe. The way I understand, Ksharapurusha refers to the mind, intellect, and egoism, which is part of Aparaprakriti, the inferior nature, inferior Prakriti, or lower Prakriti. In other words, Aparaprakriti refers to nature as a whole, minus the substratum and Lord, which is Paraprakriti or Shakti, and Ksharapurusha refers to the same in the context of the microcosm, the apparent doer or ego. Is my understanding correct? I don't want to give any overconfident answer because that's a good question, but it becomes technical. But at the same time, I do wonder why you're restricting Aparaprakriti just to, why you're restricting Ksharapurusha just to mind, intellect, and egoism. Because in chapter 15, when we get to it, we'll find Krishna's definition of Ksharapurusha is Kshara Sarvani Bhutani. All creatures, all beings are encompassed by Ksharapurusha, by this, literally Kshara means decaying, but it means the mobile, dynamic Purusha. Divine manifest as this dynamic Leela, as this world basically, as everything in this world, sentient and insentient. That's how I see Ksharapurusha. So I actually don't see, I wouldn't restrict Ksharapurusha to just mind, intellect, and egoism in that way. That would be my answer. So I think that if you were to ask me what is the difference between Ksharapurusha and Aparaprakriti, Aparaprakriti I would say is actually narrower. Because Ksharapurusha is the divine manifest as Ksharapurusha. That's the way I see it. Ksharapurusha is the divine manifest as Aparaprakriti. As these chairs, as the plants, as these beings. Okay? So to me, that's how I see the Purushottama itself in the form of sentient and insentient things in this world is the Ksharapurusha. Sultan asks, when Sri Aurobindo talks about equanimity, he speaks that the divine worker, quote, does not rejoice in the touches of the pleasant or feel anguish in the touches of the unpleasant. As spiritual aspirants, what happens when we find spiritual things pleasant and worldly things unpleasant? For example, weekly meetings with devotees, coming to classes like wonderful classes like this, and discussing spiritual topics or going on hikes. He's really hitting close to home with the hikes here. Is a consistent, pleasant experience. Anthony may beg to differ on the consistent, pleasant experience. I'm joking there. Woo! Okay. I learned 2 weeks later, you weren't here for the last hike, but Leela was here. There was a group in our hiking group of 30, about 30, that came later than you guys. Are you aware of that?
Oh, really?
Nish and his group, the ones who left before us, they ended up, the 5 of them, when they left, they went down the Jnana Yoga path, they got horribly lost. And they're stuck in the dark. They didn't get back to the trailhead till 9 p.m. They got back at 8 p.m. that party. So anyway, adventure. Anyway, but for many, yes, hiking is a consistent, pleasant experience that brings joy. That brings joy. Sultan continues. Moments when I cave into worldly desires are moments when I feel anguish. Should I be training myself to not look at these experiences in this way? So look, spiritual life is a journey, and I see it as a graded journey, and that everything depends on where you are, in spiritual life. And Swamiji will say, you don't move from error to truth, but from lower truth to higher truth. And it just actually can go back to something that one of the other issues that some people have been raising. It's like, when I'm doing something for God, I want to do my best, and then I'm worried about it, and I'm concerned. Of course you are, and that's good at a certain level. But at some point in spiritual life, in your spiritual evolution, even that will go. So likewise, there is a point in your spiritual journey when it's extremely helpful, if not necessary, to take joy in sattvika things, like coming to satsanga, coming to Gita class, as opposed to partying with your friends, and especially if your friends are not particularly sattvic, it depends on what kind of partying you're doing. It's like the thing to do at that stage is to cultivate a joy in those spiritual activities, to cultivate joy in japa and this and that. But at a higher stage, number one kicks in, absence of personal egoism and doership. Because even that joy is sattvic, right? But at some point you have to transcend the three gunas. You have to go beyond even sattva. And at that point you just become a pure instrument of the divine. And you don't do things because you like them. You do things because that's the thing to be done and as an instrument of the divine. And even if it's very unpleasant, that's what Anthony was also talking about earlier, about how sometimes the work is very unpleasant, right? And it can be painful, right? And that's part of the journey. But eventually, and that's part of the spiritual practice, is that engaging in that work that even is unpleasant to the best of your ability with full enthusiasm. That's the challenge, right, in spiritual life. Okay. Any questions here? Yes, Suman.
Not a question, but I just want to put it in this way.
Mm-hmm.
The karma yoga part actually in an action is pertains to what the inner result of that action is, right? I mean, in the sense that a good karma yogi might not be the best of the workman, might not have the best skill.
Oh yeah, that's true. Yeah, sure.
But he still could be doing that work in a more desireless way.
Correct.
Than another person who is more skilled, but he's doing it for his own self, for his desires.
That's a nice nuance, which I think is important, which is, and in fact, there's a verse in the Gita which says, Shreyan swadharmo vigunaha paradharmatsu nishchitat. It's better to do your swadharma, even if there are certain defects, or even if, I really like Tapasanji's gloss on this translation, I like it the best, even if it's not glamorous, than to do another person's duty, but even if you do it really, really well. So it means, if it's your swadharma, if the work you're meant to do, right, is something that you're not the best at, right? There might be somebody else who's objectively better at that work than you are. But if that's your swadharma, that's the thing that you should be doing. And that's the way that you'll make maximal spiritual progress. Even if externally, you may not be doing the worst work as perfectly as that person who's kind of born to do that kind of work. And I think that's true. But at the same time, what I'd say is, you have to figure out, first of all, what is your swadharma? And that's not always obvious. In the past, there was a time when there's a hereditary caste system, and so it's dictated to you. Oh, my dad was a carpenter, so I'm a carpenter, and this and that, at least in an Indian context, that kind of thing. But nowadays, it requires a lot of soul searching and honesty and bracketing out of ego. Because it's the ego that has anxieties, that wants to please your parents, that wants to impress society, that follows what's prestigious. When I was an undergrad graduating, the most prestigious job to get out of graduation was what? I'm saying 2002. I'm revealing my age. But management consulting. McKinsey. Is it still the thing now? I hope not. Man.
Silicon Valley.
It's irritating. Now Silicon Valley, yeah. But yeah. So the best minds are all going into management consulting and this and that. Not necessarily. Some of them love it, but not all of them. A lot of them aren't because it's prestigious, because they make a lot of money and this and that, right? So yeah, no, I think that's a good question. But you do it to the best. You figure out what your swadharma is. That's really important. And it might be that you're not the best possible person at that work, but if you really feel it's your swadharma, you're doing it for the right reasons, then doing it as karma yoga will still make you the best worker you can be in that context, right? It'll bring the best out of you. And remember, the final aim of work is not actually to help this world. Because Swamiji would say this world is like a dog's curly tail. Every time you try to straighten it, it'll curl back up. So none of us should try to save the world. We're trying to save ourselves. We have enough problems going on within, right? And so that's the real purpose, is we help ourselves through all this activity. Okay. A reminder for those who came a little bit late. The January classes, because I'm not able to hold classes on Sundays for the entire month of January, so I'm asking that you guys take time out of your busy schedules and come on 2 Mondays. Namely, Monday, January 13th, 7:30 p.m. and Monday, January 27th at 7:30 p.m. here in the Greenhouse Living Room. And our next assignment is, to repeat, Monday, January 13th, 7:30 p.m., Essays on the Gita, chapter 19, the next chapter, called Equality. It's a beautiful chapter. pages 188 to 199, and to answer the study questions based on that chapter 19, and read verses 4.21 to 4.23. That's almost, you've already done that more or less. And any final questions before we wrap up this class? No? Okay, thanks so much. I've got a Sunday talk now. My work never ends. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat Sri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu. And I've got a bit of a, not sore throat, but can you tell that I'm coming off a cold? No? Oh, good. Yeah, a little, huh?
A little sniffly, but it don't.
Not too bad. Okay, good. To me, I sound really nasal. All right, good.
When you get going, it warms everything.
Oh, good. Okay, all right. You're so nice. Stop. I'm gonna become egoistic. If you say
Just drink some hot tea.
I know. I
and
just
clear
had
your
this nice
throat.
sore throat tea.
Maybe a little warm water.
Maybe I'll bring another tea to the Sunday talk
Yeah.
too. Does it look
Yeah.
bad to do that? Or
No.
you guys are all understanding. Even monks have bodies.
It reminds me
Yes.
it reminds me